some way conveyors of meaning. Let me read the part without the interjection. I shall argue that there can be no other answer than this if one chooses to view the many and varied attempts to talk about the ineffable as exercises that are both coherent and in some way conveyors of meaning. The single claim I shall defend this morning as the answer to the question posed in my title, the title is the first question, the second question is the subtitle. So the answer I'm going to defend is this: yes and no, or yes but not yes, and or yes no. That's the answer. Well, it might seem to the uninitiated as if I am merely playing with words. I am quite serious in asserting, first, that this answer is definite and singular, though it admittedly consists of at least three distinct parts. Second, that it is the only possible answer one can state to the question as posed. And third, that my answer to the question does not preclude the option of giving no answer whatsoever, that is, of remaining silent. For as clarified by the subtitle, the second question in the title, the question makes no assumptions about whether or not one must talk about the ineffable in order to understand it. Wittgensteinian silence in the face of the ineffable may well be not only possible, but perhaps even superior to writing articles and books about the unsayable, or giving lectures like this one that claim to convey something meaningful about it. Be that as it may, my concern today is to identify the basic principles that make it possible to talk or write meaningful about what cannot be said. And throughout this talk, throughout the paper I'm reading, anytime I use the word talk or say, I'm referring to verbal or written language. I won't use both from now on, I'll just say talk or say. What must be stated as clearly as possible, therefore, right at the outset of any inquiry such as this one, is that the subject matter we are discussing is linguistic, due to the undeniable fact that we are talking about it, even though what we are talking about is non-linguistic. That is, the subject matter of the unsayable is, by definition, the realm of human experience that defies explanation in human language. The set of experiences that, try as we might, we cannot adequately express in words. So the question I'm posing in this lecture is, when we nevertheless talk about that unsayable realm of human experience, does our form of discourse take on a set of characteristics that can be reduced to a logical form? Once again, my single definite answer to this question is, I'll say it a little bit faster this time, yes and no, or yes but not yes, and or yes no. Funny though this answer may seem, I can seriously affirm that my answer is not intended as a joke, or at least not primarily so. That we may find the single definite answer to our question to be somewhat humorous, however, does have implications for the entire project that Professor Frank has undertaken, or anything like that project. Implications that I'll mention again briefly at the end of this talk. If we take seriously the admittedly humorous fact that my question today is about the logic of any attempt to say what cannot be said, then the easiest way to approach an assessment of my alleged answer, that is, that the logic that governs any attempt to say what cannot be said, is precisely yes and no, or yes but not yes, and or yes no, then the easiest way to approach any assessment to that alleged answer will be to consider first the standard time-honored answer to the related question, what is the logic of any attempt to say what can be said? For that question, the most obvious place to turn is to Aristotle. One need not go further than the most basic introduction to logic textbook or a number of Aristotle's own writings, to learn that the most fundamental basis for human linguistic communication rests on the interrelationship between three basic logical laws. I don't need to say any of this, but it's in my paper, so I'll say it anyway. They are often called the law of identity, the law of contradiction, and the law of the excluded middle. I shall refer to the second of these laws as the law of non-contradiction for reasons that will soon become clear. For now, let it suffice to say that the proper name for this law, in my view, should reflect what the law accomplishes. Aristotle's second law shows us not how to contradict ourselves, but it shows us how not to contradict ourselves. So I call it the law of non-contradiction. Reducing the three laws to their most basic logical form, we can express them as A equals A. That's more or less, as Aristotle put it, a thing is what it is. Or that's the law of identity. Second one, A does not equal not A. That is, a thing is not its opposite, the law of non-contradiction. And this one is a little bit harder to put into a formula, but I express the formula as 0 equals not A or not A, which I take to represent the law of the excluded middle. That is, nothing is neither A or not A. Nothing is neither A nor not A. In order to understand the claim I am making about the logic of any attempt to talk about the ineffable, I must make one crucial adjustment to the standard Aristotelian laws. Whereas Aristotle portrayed his three laws as universal, covering all coherent, meaningful uses of language whatsoever, I claim that his laws properly apply only to one of the two main ways that human beings have of using language, namely to talk about what can be said. To signify that Aristotle's three laws do not apply to all language whatsoever, but only to the way of using language that keeps itself within these strict limits, the limits of what can be said, I call his three laws the laws of analytic logic. Anytime we use language in an attempt to analyze the constituent parts of what can be parsed, these three laws hold true. Indeed, they must be followed by anyone who wants their words to make sense. The claim that the basis of my talk today, that is, that the logic, the claim that is the basis of my talk today, that the logic of the ineffable can be defined as yes and no, or yes but not yes, and or yes no, similarly applies only to one realm of human discourse. I refer to the logic of that realm as synthetic logic. With this in mind, let us now proceed to examine each of the component parts of my answer to the question at hand. Is there a logic of the ineffable? The first part of the three-in-one answer I've given is yes and no. The yes component of this part of the answer is justifiable because I am now in the process of stating, I hope clearly and precisely, what the logic of the ineffable is. So it obviously must exist. However, the answer is also no, because, as will soon become apparent, if it is not already all too blatantly so, what this logic governs is not the ineffable as such, but any attempt to talk coherently about the ineffable. As Frank so powerfully adumbrates in his book, the unsayable is by definition something that cannot be said. So when we talk about it, we are not in fact talking about it in any literal sense. Rather, we are at best evoking a form of experience, an experience that is what it is, even if it is never put into words. Perhaps some of you have already noticed that this first part of my threefold answer, the yes and no, exhibits a form that is precisely the opposite of Aristotle's second law of analytic logic. Whereas we must take great pains to ensure when talking about the sayable that when we say A, we do not mean not A, for to mean both would be to contradict ourselves. When we talk about the unsayable, we must take equal care to ensure that when we say A, we do also mean not A. For if we only mean A when we say A, then we are talking literally about the sayable, not symbolically about the unsayable. The first law of synthetic logic, therefore, is what I call the law of contradiction, or A equals not A. So these are analytic, and maybe I'll put them here. These are the synthetic laws. In my initial statement of the logic of the ineffable, I expressed this perhaps somewhat deceptively, but therefore all the more accurately, as yes and no. Yes and no. So the minus A in my formula always indicates the opposite of the A. It should be a word that refers to the opposite. The second part of my answer, which you may recall was or, yes but not yes, is, as should now be readily apparent, the negation of Aristotle's first law. Just as Aristotle's law of identity ensures that ensures that if we are talking about what is sayable, then we must always mean A when we say A. This second law of synthetic logic requires us not to mean A whenever we utter A, in an attempt to convey a coherent and meaningful truth about the unsayable. I therefore call this second law of synthetic logic the law of non-identity, or A does not equal A. The definite answer I posed at the outset of this talk expressed this law, as I just stated, as yes but not yes. Frank's masterful work on the unsayable contains examples of expressions that illustrate these two basic laws of synthetic logic on nearly every page. Due to limitations of time, and so that the rest of you have a chance to talk today too, I'll just limit myself to two simple examples. First, on pages 13 and 14, right at the outset of chapter 1, he points out that in Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare's bottom, quote, says over and over again what cannot be said. I take this as a possible way of, or we can reduce the logic of that statement to A equals not A. So this claim can only properly be understood by a reader who recognizes that the author is intentionally contradicting himself. Likewise, just another almost random example, on page 145, Frank states that, quote, the one cannot be said unequivocally to be one. Again, this claim can convey its intended meaning accurately and successfully only if we, the readers, take the words to mean that the author is intentionally identifying the unidentifiable. A does not equal A. One who reads such statements with, by the way, I didn't quite get a perfect example. It would have been better if that quote had said, the one is actually many, or something like that, because then the second part of it would have more accurately reflected. It's okay the way it is. It's okay the way it is. The other way would have been A equals not A. Okay, one who reads such statements with Aristotle's laws of identity and non-contradiction in mind is bound to be befuddled and therefore blocked from experiencing the deep truth that is revealed in such statements. What role then is played by the third part of my answer, which, as you may recall, was and or yes, no. This statement negates Aristotle's law of the excluded middle, affirming instead that when we talk about the ineffable, we are compelled to assume what I call the law of the included middle. This law ensures that between any two opposite terms, a space always exists for a middle term that is neither A nor not A, even though it is also somehow both in one unified whole. This, of course, amounts to saying that the thing we are talking about is an utter mystery. And that is precisely what is affirmed over and over again by all those who use words coherently to talk about the unsayable. This, I take it, is the gist of Frank's critique of Hegel, even though his dialectical logic bore a striking resemblance to the first two laws of synthetic logic. Hegel refused to admit that the absolute of which he spoke was not the ultimately rational, but the ultimate mystery. To take the law of included middle as one of the required laws of synthetic logic, the laws of the unsayable, then that indicates that what we're talking about is a mystery, not something rational. Incidentally, the conjunctions used in my initial answer are also quite specific. When talking about the unsayable, we must always take care to abide by all three of Aristotle's laws of analytic logic. Those who talk about the unsayable, by contrast, are compelled to select one of two paths, typically called the way of affirmation and the way of negation. The first employs analogical thinking to affirm that some A is equal to something that is quite distinct from, and perhaps even opposite to A. That is, the way of affirmation is ultimately grounded in the law of contradiction. A is not A. The way of negation, by contrast, employs more literal, quasi-analytical thinking to deny that any A is actually A, a clear application of the law of non-identity. In both cases, these time-honored ways are mutually exclusive, hence my use of or between the first and second parts of my threefold answer. One who wishes to talk about the unsayable must choose one or the other. I think of Pseudo-Dionysius with his way of affirmation and way of negation. If you somehow tried to write something that mixed both ways of talking, I'm pretty sure it would not make sense, even to someone who is open to talking about the unsayable. But it makes sense because first he chooses one logic, and then he chooses the other logic, and he runs with them both separately. Yet, ironically, what one ends up saying in each case could also be portrayed as the same, namely, as a yes-no paradox that is both affirmation and negation at the same time. This, of course, cannot be the case. Yet, when we are talking about what cannot be said, it most precisely is the case. That is, even though the ways of affirmation and negation must be kept quite distinct from each other when talking about the unsayable, they both equally depend on inclusive thinking. As such, the mystery of inclusion can be combined with either affirmation or negation, and both, in order to generate meaningful talk about the ineffable. Indeed, we do this every time we appeal to mystery in a statement. In a statement that, other than the appeal, employs analytic logic to make a statement about the unsayable. So in other words, my point is that when we're talking about the unsayable using the law of the included middle, the statement will look like analytic logic, but then it will appeal to a mystery. But it can also link to either of the other two and appeal to the mystery. Let me summarize my central claim then as clearly as possible. Ironic though it may seem, a clear grasp of the logical basis for our use of words is just as important when talking about the unsayable as it is when talking about the sayable. Once we realize that the former is merely the negation of the latter, that the fixed laws of synthetic logic can be readily defined simply by stating the opposites of the laws of analytic logic, the clarity and forcefulness of our talk about the unsayable can only be enhanced. In conclusion, therefore, and extremely briefly, I suggest that the universality of humor among users of language is arguably the best evidence that talk about the unsayable has a logic. For as I have argued elsewhere, in a paper I presented here in Macau a number of years ago, which, by the way, remains unpublished. I'll gladly send it to anybody who wants a good laugh. The logic of humor is also grounded in the same laws of synthetic logic that govern our talk about the unsayable. This, I maintain, is why anyone with an open mind toward the transcendent is bound to find talk about the unsayable as incredibly funny, yet without in the least disrespecting its profound meaningfulness in the process.
So we have a few minutes. Maybe we have time for 2 questions or so.
A few lines. Yeah, I can very right from the beginning.
In your synthetic and analytic grammars that you've put up here, you consistently reverted to the conjunction yes and no. Could you just clarify, in the mutually exclusive logics that then become inclusive, are you wanting to create an identity so much so that you then do away with the conjunction? It's not an and between the two, but it's a is. Yes is no.
Are you referring to the, by the way, I didn't write down my formula of the law of the included middle. Are you only referring to that? Or
No, it could be anything on that synthetic side.
So, just to, this isn't what you asked, but I struggled a lot with what formula I would use here, but in the end I decided this was probably the most accurate one, but where 1 simply indicates that there is something there. 0 indicates that there's nothing. It doesn't mean literally 1, but something is whatever. Okay. So
I think there's 2 different ways of expressing something. Yes and no. Yes is no.
Right.
I'm really wondering whether you want to end up at the latter, or are you happy just to stay at the former?
I'm not sure that they're different.
Okay.
Simply because, mathematically speaking, I mean, I know language is not always perfectly mathematical, but if you subtract, if you take 1 to the other side, maybe they become the same. Yes. Yes is no. Okay. No, they're not exactly the same. My initial inclination to your question, although I want to think about it a little bit more, is that I would want the conjunction to occur here. Okay. But I have to admit that in the work I've done on this previously, I've almost always dealt only with the first 2 laws. Only recently did it occur to me that to make my system of synthetic logic complete, I should try to reverse the 3rd law as well. And I'm thinking that would be, if I'm going to make a distinction between yes is no, which is, you're right, that's what I'm doing here, and yes and no, then I would make it here. Okay. But I'm still working on what's the best way of formulating both of these, actually. What I put here is just what I actually came up with last night as I was kind of frantically thinking how can I write the last couple paragraphs on that part. I hope that's helpful. But you make a good point that they are distinct because yes is no could simply be conveying that, I mean, if something is essentially a zero, yes is no would not necessarily be contradictory. Of course, that's also true, yes and no. I want to think about that a little bit more, because I haven't really thought, in the past, I haven't really thought of those two as different. So, and do you think they are?
I suggest that the moment you entertain yes is no, you necessarily must move out of a linguistic context, which you began by contextualizing what you had to say as a linguistic question.
Yeah.
And I think yes is no forces us out of that into some kind of ontology or otherwise.
Okay.
And we can talk more about that
Yeah,
when we get to
yeah.
Hegel.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Okay.
No, thank you, Steve. I thought that was wonderful, really, as a start for us. And I sense the humor right from the beginning, that there's one definite answer to this question. It was performative, I think, and that's crucial for the Apophatic. I felt you really performing in a comedic mode right from the
Thank you.
beginning.
I was a little bit worried that the humor might not come across.
Well, you brought it out yourself
Okay.
explicitly at the end. I was glad that you did that. And, I suppose maybe linking with Andrew's last query here, I'm struck by the fact that you took this up as a question of logic, because I know you as a famous Kant scholar, and I was thinking the question would be, is a critique of apophatic reason possible or not? This I find very intriguing and rigorous, and I'm very happy to start with this. And the question in the back of my mind is how you would, or why you wouldn't try to take up this question of the critique of apophatic reason. So, I don't necessarily need an answer to that, but it intrigues me to just see how you approach this.
I think doing that would be possible, although of course Kant himself wouldn't have thought of doing it this way. Kant's critique would almost certainly appeal to our moral sense, to our moral, I don't know if sense is the right word, to our moral nature. And if you read Kant's writing carefully about morality, you do find synthetic logic all over the place. But I'm not convinced that Kant was aware of it. He somehow didn't want to think that he was contradicting himself. And I see a problem there, actually. So although I'm an almost undying defender of Kant, I don't defend him all the way. And yeah, a Kantian critique of the apophatic tradition, in a nutshell, to the extent that I've already dealt with that a little bit in some of my previous work, what I've argued is that his critique of the apophatic tradition is that if your talk about the unsayable leads you into a denial of morality, then it has gone too far. So whatever you do with your talk of the unsayable, it needs to enhance your experience of what it is to be a moral human being, rather than detract from it. And if it enhances that, then I've argued briefly in one of the chapters in Kant's Critical Religion that Kant is all for it. I call that his critical mysticism.
Good, thank you. Maybe one other remark in the present side. The humor of his apophatic way of thinking is something, we have famous Kant scholars here as well. I say that in the plural. Chuang-Tzu is really the funniest philosopher that I've ever read. And I think it comes from what you're identifying as the humor of apophaticism. So, there are other people that would be able to really expand on that much better than I, and I just throw that out. I'm looking forward to what they have to say on that topic.